The Manhattan skyline gleamed like scattered diamonds against the twilight, its towers of glass and steel reaching toward heaven. Inside the 57th floor of Sterling Technologies, a woman in a cream-colored dress held her daughter close, their silhouettes framed against the dying sun. Vivian Sterling, 34 years old and one of the most powerful CEOs in New York, cradled 8-year-old Adelaide as three of the city's most renowned physicians delivered their verdict. Their words fell like stones into still water. The child would never see. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not ever. But fate has a peculiar way of rewriting certainties, and sometimes truth comes from the most unexpected places. Vivian Sterling commanded boardrooms with the same precision surgeons wielded scalpels. Her long blonde hair, naturally wavy and cascading past her shoulders, caught the light as she moved through her empire of chrome and crystal. The cream-colored dress she favored, with its subtle V neckline and tailored silhouette, spoke of understated power. Her face, beautiful, yet carved with sharp edges of determination, rarely betrayed emotion. At 34, she had inherited Sterling Technologies from her father and transformed it into a force that made competitors tremble. Yet for all her victories in the marketplace, for all the hostile takeovers she had orchestrated and the billions she commanded, Vivian Sterling faced one battle she could not win. Her daughter Adelaide had been born into darkness, and no amount of money or influence could purchase the light. Adelaide Sterling lived in a world of sounds and textures, of voices and whispers, but never colors or faces. 8 years old with straight blonde hair that her mother tied each morning with a red ribbon, she possessed a face of porcelain innocence marked by gray eyes that stared at nothing. Those eyes, clouded like winter fog, moved but never focused, searched but never found. She spent her days in a wheelchair not because her legs failed her, but because the world was too vast and dangerous for a child who could not see its edges. Her voice, when she chose to use it, came soft and hesitant, as if she feared her words might bump into things she could not perceive. 36 blocks away in Brooklyn, in a modest brownstone that had seen better decades, Henry Carter was teaching his son to tie his shoes. At 36, Henry stood 6 feet tall, with the build of someone who had once played college football, but now worked with his hands. His brown hair, kept short and practical, framed a face weathered by loss but softened by kindness. The flannel shirts he favored, usually in shades of red and black plaid, hung over worn jeans that had been washed to comfort. His eyes, deep brown and steady, held the weight of someone who had witnessed life's cruelest joke and somehow found a way to keep breathing. Once a biomedical engineer at Mount Sinai Hospital, Henry had walked away from that life 3 years ago when his wife died in what the hospital called an unavoidable complication. Now he repaired vintage electronics in a small shop, finding solace in bringing dead things back to life. 7-year-old Liam Carter possessed his father's brown hair, but his late mother's boundless energy. Where Adelaide was stillness, Liam was motion. Where she was silence, he was laughter. His hazel eyes sparkled with mischief that no amount of single parenting could dim. He wore his dinosaur t-shirt like armor and treated every park visit like an expedition to undiscovered lands. The boy had learned early that death was real and permanent, but instead of letting it shadow him, he seemed determined to live twice as bright, as if making up for the light his mother could no longer shine. The worlds of Manhattan and Brooklyn might as well have been different planets, separated not by the East River but by chasms of class and circumstance. Vivian's mornings began with imported coffee served in bone china, while reviewing market reports from Tokyo. Henry started with instant coffee in a chipped mug while making Liam's lunch for school. She worried about hostile takeovers and quarterly earnings. He worried about making rent and keeping the electricity on. Their paths should never have crossed. Their orbits should never have intersected. But Adelaide had been restless that Saturday morning, and for once, Vivian decided her daughter needed more than the sterile safety of their penthouse prison. Central Park in early spring held promises of renewal that even concrete and asphalt could not entirely suppress. Cherry blossoms had begun their brief, glorious rebellion against winter, and families spread across the great lawn like scattered seeds of happiness. Vivian pushed Adelaide's wheelchair along the path, her Louboutin heels impractical for the terrain but worn anyway, a kind of armor against ordinariness. She had dismissed the bodyguards for the morning, craving something that resembled normalcy, though she barely remembered what that meant anymore. Adelaide tilted her face toward where she sensed the sun should be, her small hands gripping the wheelchair's arms. She could hear children laughing, dogs barking, the distant music of a street performer, and for a moment, her usual stillness cracked with something that might have been longing. Vivian noticed and knelt beside her daughter, her voice gentle in a way she never allowed in boardrooms. The child's response came as whisper. A confession of wanting to walk, to run, to be like the laughing voices that danced around them. Vivian's heart, that carefully guarded organ she had trained to feel nothing during business negotiations, cracked just a little. She helped Adelaide from the wheelchair, guiding her to a bench, holding her hands as the girl took tentative steps on grass she could feel but not see. That was when Adelaide stumbled, her foot catching on something, perhaps nothing, perhaps everything. She pitched forward with a small cry of surprise, and Vivian, despite her quick reflexes, was a heartbeat too slow. But someone else was not. Strong hands caught Adelaide before she hit the ground, lifting her gently, setting her upright with the practiced ease of a parent who had caught 1,000 falls. Henry Carter had been teaching Liam to throw a baseball when he saw the girl stumble. His instinct was immediate and unconscious. The same impulse that had once made him a good engineer, and now made him a good father. He steadied the child, noting her expensive dress, her unseeing eyes, the way she flinched at the touch of a stranger. Liam, curious as always, had followed his father, and now stood staring at this girl who looked like a princess from one of his storybooks, but moved like she was navigating a dream. Vivian's gratitude lasted exactly 3 seconds before it transformed into defensive suspicion. She pulled Adelaide back, her eyes scanning Henry with the same intensity she used to evaluate hostile takeover targets. He looked like exactly what he was. A working-class single father out for a morning in the park, which in Vivian's experience meant he probably wanted something. Everyone always wanted something from the sterling fortune. But Liam, blessed with the social boundaries of a golden retriever, had already started talking to Adelaide. He told her about the baseball, about how it felt when you caught it just right, about the sound it made hitting the glove. Adelaide's head turned toward his voice, and something extraordinary happened. She smiled. Not the polite practice smile she gave to doctors and tutors, but a real smile that reached her clouded eyes and made her whole face transform. Henry watched this interaction while simultaneously noticing something else. When the sun broke through the clouds at just the right angle, when it hit Adelaide's eyes directly, there was something, a flicker, a reaction in her pupils that should not have been there if she was completely blind. His biomedical training, dormant, but not dead, stirred to life. He observed her tracking Liam's movement, not perfectly, not clearly, but there was something there. Some response to light and shadow that complete blindness would not allow. The words came out before he could stop them, spoken with the quiet certainty of someone who had once made a living understanding how bodies worked and failed. The girl was not completely blind. There was light in those eyes, trapped perhaps, misdirected certainly, but not absent. The statement hung in the air like a challenge to the natural order of Vivian's carefully controlled world. Vivian's reaction was swift and sharp, her voice cutting through the morning air like a blade through silk. How dare this stranger, this nobody, suggest that teams of specialists were wrong? Did he think she had not consulted every expert money could buy? Did he imagine she had not explored every possibility, every treatment, every desperate hope? Her anger was magnificent and terrible, the fury of a mother who had been forced to accept the unacceptable, now being told that acceptance might have been premature. But Henry did not back down. He had faced down hospital administrators after his wife's death, had stood against systems and authorities who insisted on their own infallibility. He spoke calmly about light reflex, about pupillary response, about the difference between cortical blindness and ocular blindness. He mentioned his background, his training, careful not to oversell but unable to entirely hide the expertise that lurked beneath his flannel shirt and workman's hands. Adelaide, meanwhile, had found Liam's hand and was holding it while he described the color of the sky, using words like blue, like when you're really happy, and white clouds like marshmallows. She laughed, actually laughed, and the sound made both adults stop their confrontation and stare. That night, Vivian could not sleep. She stood at her penthouse window, looking out at the city lights, replaying the morning's encounter. The rational part of her, The CEO, who had built an empire on data and facts, insisted the man was a charlatan or deluded. But the mother in her, the part she usually kept locked away during business hours, whispered, what if? What if the doctors were wrong? What if there was hope she had been told did not exist? What if she had accepted defeat too easily? She pulled up Henry Carter's information, using resources that would have made privacy advocates weep. Former biomedical engineer at Mount Sinai, graduated with honors from Columbia. Published papers on neural pathway restoration. Wife deceased. One son. Current occupation electronics repair. Nothing about him suggested con artist or opportunist. Everything about him suggested someone who had retreated from a life that had hurt him too much to continue. The next morning, she called Dr. Rodriguez, who had been Adelaide's physician since birth. She asked questions she had never thought to ask before, pushed in ways she had never pushed. Rodriguez's answers were practiced, smooth, but there was something underneath. A nervousness that Vivian's years of reading Boardroom Tells immediately recognized. When she mentioned meeting someone who suggested Adelaide might have some light perception, Rodriguez's pause was a millisecond too long, his denial a note too sharp. Vivian made a decision that went against every instinct her father had bred into her. She reached out to Henry Carter. Not through lawyers or intermediaries, but directly, with a phone call that took her 20 minutes to dial. His surprise was evident, but he agreed to meet, suggesting neutral ground, a coffee shop in Queens, where neither Manhattan power nor Brooklyn pride held sway. They sat across from each other over coffee that was neither imported nor instant, finding middle ground in mediocrity. Henry brought Liam's drawings, colorful chaos that he spread on the table, explaining how visual processing worked, how the brain could sometimes find alternate pathways, how damage was not always as complete as it appeared. Vivian listened with the intensity she usually reserved for merger negotiations, asking pointed questions, challenging assumptions, testing for weakness in his logic. Adelaide had been born premature, Vivian explained, her voice losing its corporate edge as she recalled those terrifying early days. The doctors had said the optic nerves were damaged, that the visual cortex was compromised, that hope was cruel when science was clear. She had paid for 17 different opinions, flown in specialists from Switzerland and Japan, subjected her infant daughter to every test that existed. They all said the same thing: Adelaide would never see. Henry listened without interrupting, recognizing the grief that masqueraded as anger, the pain that dressed itself in designer clothing. When she finished, he asked a simple question that changed everything. Had anyone ever tested Adelaide's response to specific wavelengths of light? Not just general light perception, but specific frequencies that might bypass damaged pathways. Vivian's silence was answer enough. 3 days later, in a private clinic that Vivian's money had quietly opened after hours, Henry conducted simple tests, while Adelaide sat patiently, Liam by her side describing everything like a play-by-play announcer. Red light, blue light, different intensities, different angles, and there it was, subtle but undeniable. Adelaide's pupils responded. Her eyes tracked, imperfectly, but consistently. She had been living in darkness, not because light could not enter, but because her brain had never learned to properly process what her damaged, but not destroyed optical system was receiving. Dr. Rodriguez broke down when confronted with the new tests. The truth spilled out like water through a broken dam. Damien Cross, Vivian's rival at Cross Industries, had been there at Adelaide's birth, had connections at the hospital, had suggested that a blind child would make Vivian vulnerable, distracted, weak. Rodriguez had been promised research funding, had been threatened with career destruction, had been convinced that if Adelaide could not see perfectly, it was kinder to say she could not see at all. He had altered test results, suppressed possibilities, condemned a child to darkness to serve the ambitions of powerful men. Vivian's rage was ice and fire simultaneously, but it was controlled, channeled, weaponized. She did not call her lawyers immediately. She did not launch the corporate missiles at her disposal. Instead, she sat with Adelaide, holding her daughter, while Henry explained in simple terms what they had discovered. Adelaide's tears were not of sadness, but of hope, the first hope she had ever been allowed to feel about her eyes. Damien Cross arrived at the Sterling Technologies building the next morning, as he did every quarter. for the board meeting where he held enough shares to be a perpetual thorn in Vivian's side. At 40, he carried himself with the kind of arrogance that came from inheriting wealth rather than earning it. His white blonde hair was slicked back with products that cost more than most people's rent. His gray eyes cold as winter stone. His tall, thin frame draped in silver-gray suits that seemed to shimmer with malice. He had always viewed Vivian as an usurper, a woman playing in a man's world, made worse by the fact that she played it better than he ever could. The boardroom that morning was different. Vivian was there, of course, in her usual seat at the head of the table, but beside her sat Henry Carter, looking somewhat uncomfortable in a borrowed suit but steady in his purpose. The board members whispered among themselves, wondering who this stranger was, why he was present at what should have been a routine quarterly review. Vivian let Damien begin his usual presentation about market inefficiencies and missed opportunities. Let him build to his familiar crescendo about leadership changes needed for Sterling Technologies to reach its full potential. Then she stood, her voice cutting through his words like a scythe through wheat. She spoke about Adelaide, about 8 years of darkness, about medical fraud and corporate manipulation. She presented evidence with the same methodical precision she used to dissect earnings reports. Damien's composure cracked, then shattered. He tried denials, then deflection, then threats. But Vivian had recordings, Rodriguez's confession, paper trails that Henry's engineering mind had helped her follow to their damning conclusions. The board sat in stunned silence as the full scope of Damien's manipulation was revealed. Not just of Adelaide's condition but of stock prices, of insider trading timed to Vivian's moments of maternal crisis. Henry spoke then, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had nothing to gain and nothing to lose. He explained the medical aspects, the treatments now possible, the crime of stolen years that could never be returned. He looked directly at Damien as he spoke about the kind of evil that would condemn a child to darkness for corporate advantage. The authorities were already waiting outside. Vivian had timed it perfectly, as she did everything in her professional life. Damien Cross was led away in handcuffs that caught the light from photographers she had not called, but had not prevented from knowing where to be. By market close, Cross Industries' stock had plummeted, and Sterling Technologies had absorbed what remained, a hostile takeover executed with surgical precision. But the real victory was quieter, happening in a specialized treatment center where Adelaide was learning to see. It was not miraculous or instant. Henry had been clear about that. Her optic nerves were damaged, would always be damaged. But the brain was plastic, adaptable, capable of finding new paths when old ones were blocked. With specific light therapy, with exercises that seemed more like games when Liam was involved, with patience and time, Adelaide began to distinguish light from dark, then shapes, then colors. The first color she identified with certainty was red, the color of the ribbon in her hair. She touched it with wonder, seeing and feeling simultaneously for the first time. Her face illuminated with joy that made Vivian sob openly, abandoning all pretense of corporate composure. Henry stood nearby, not intruding but present, his steady presence having become something Vivian had learned to rely upon. The media found the story irresistible, the CEO and the single father, the blind girl and the medical conspiracy, the corporate villain brought low by his own cruelty. But Damien had one last card to play, leaked stories suggesting Henry was a con artist, that he had manipulated a desperate mother, that his credentials were fabricated, his intentions mercenary. The tabloids ran with it, as tabloids do. And suddenly, Henry found himself portrayed as the villain in a story where he had only tried to help. Vivian watched Henry weather this storm, with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything. He did not defend himself publicly, did not hire lawyers or publicists, simply continued showing up for Adelaide's treatments, bringing Liam to play with her, being present in a way that spoke louder than any press release. She realized then, what she had been too guarded to admit before, that somewhere between that first meeting in Central Park and these sessions teaching Adelaide to see, she had fallen in love with this man who fixed broken things and never gave up on lost causes. The press conference was Vivian's idea, but Adelaide made it memorable. Vivian had prepared remarks about medical fraud and corporate accountability, had lawyers ready with libel suits and evidence of Damien's media manipulation. But when the moment came, when the reporters pressed forward with their questions about Henry's credibility, Adelaide stood up from her wheelchair. She had been practicing, working with physical therapists to strengthen legs that had never needed to navigate independently. She walked slowly but steadily to the bank of microphones, her gray eyes still clouded, but now alive with purpose. She spoke clearly, her child's voice cutting through adult skepticism. She could see, she said, not perfectly, maybe never perfectly, but she could see colors and shapes and the faces of people she loved. She could see because Henry Carter had refused to accept that her darkness was permanent. She trusted him, believed in him, and if adults wanted to make that complicated, that was their problem, not hers. Then she turned, looked directly at a red exit sign across the room, and correctly identified its color. The room erupted, but Adelaide was not finished. She walked to Henry, took his hand, and said simply that he had brought light into her life when everyone else had accepted darkness. The cameras captured it all, the child's simple truth demolishing weeks of manufactured scandal. The FBI investigation that followed revealed the extent of Damien's corruption, connections that ran through medical boards and regulatory bodies, a web of manipulation that had destroyed other lives besides Adelaide's. His trial became a cautionary tale about power unchecked, about the dangers of treating human suffering as corporate leverage. He was sentenced to 27 years. His empire dissolved. His name became synonymous with a particular kind of cruelty that even hardened white-collar criminals found distasteful. Rodriguez lost his medical license, but gained something more valuable in his cooperation with authorities. Other families came forward, other children whose conditions had been manipulated or misrepresented for various gains. A class action lawsuit followed, reforms were promised, committees were formed. The system ground forward with its usual reluctant progress. But for Adelaide, the system no longer mattered. The surgery was scheduled for a Tuesday in October. When the leaves in Central Park were turning gold and red, colors Adelaide could now identify even if she could not fully appreciate their vibrancy. The procedure was experimental but not unprecedented, using new techniques to repair some of the optic nerve damage, to clear pathways that had been blocked since birth. Henry had found the specialist, a former colleague who had continued the research Henry had abandoned, who believed that Adelaide's particular pattern of damage was more treatable than originally diagnosed. Vivian held Adelaide's hand as they wheeled her into surgery, whispering promises and prayers in equal measure. Henry waited with her, Liam asleep in his lap, the four of them having become something that did not yet have a name but felt like family. The hours passed with the peculiar elasticity of hospital time, each minute both instant and eternal. When Adelaide opened her eyes after the surgery, the bandages were still in place, would stay in place for 3 more days. But her smile was radiant, as if she could already see through the gauze and darkness. The moment of revelation, when the bandages were finally removed, was both anticlimactic and miraculous. Her vision was not perfect, would never be perfect, but she could see her mother's face clearly for the first time, could trace the tears on Vivian's cheeks, could turn to Henry and Liam and see the family that had formed around her healing. They returned to Central Park on a Sunday morning, very much like the one where they had first met. But this time, Adelaide walked on her own, her steps confident, if still careful. She wore a blue dress she had chosen herself, having developed very strong opinions about colors now that she could see them. Liam ran ahead, still energy in motion, but now he regularly looked back to make sure Adelaide was following, could follow. Henry and Vivian walked together, their hands not quite touching but close enough that sometimes they did. They had not defined what they were to each other, had not needed to. The distance between Manhattan and Brooklyn seemed insignificant now, bridged by something stronger than geography or class. Vivian had learned that power meant nothing if you could not protect what you loved, and Henry had learned that sometimes healing meant opening yourself to the possibility of new wounds. Adelaide stopped at the spot where she had fallen that first day, where Henry had caught her, where everything had changed. She looked up at the sky, really looked, seeing the blue that Liam had tried so hard to describe, the clouds that really did look like marshmallows. She reached for both their hands, Liam's and Henry's, then called for her mother to complete the circle. They stood there, the four of them, as the city moved around them in its endless rhythm. Adelaide spoke about light and darkness, about how she had learned that darkness was not the absence of light but sometimes just light that had not found its way yet. She thanked Henry for believing in light she could not see, thanked her mother for being brave enough to trust a stranger, thanked Liam for making darkness less scary with his descriptions of a world she could now verify. Vivian looked at Henry across their children's heads, saw him not as the working-class single father she had first dismissed, but as the man who had saved her daughter and, in doing so, had saved her from a life of accepting the unacceptable. She spoke then, not as a CEO but as a mother and a woman, saying that truth was never permanently hidden, that sometimes it just needed the right person to reveal it, and sometimes that person came in unexpected packages. Henry's response was characteristic in its simplicity. He said that fixing broken things was what he did, but that Adelaide had never been broken. Just misunderstood. The real repair had been to the systems and people who had failed her, who had chosen darkness over difficulty. He looked at Vivian as he said that some repairs created something stronger than the original, that sometimes breaking was just the first step toward a better building. They walked home together as the sun began to set. Painting the sky in colors Adelaide watched with wonder that would never quite fade no matter how common such sights became. Liam and Adelaide ran ahead, playing a game where she had to guess colors with her eyes closed, then open them to check if she was right. Their laughter echoed off the buildings, a sound that turned strangers' heads and made them smile without knowing why. The penthouse apartment that had once felt like a prison of privilege now opened its doors to Brooklyn sensibility. Liam's drawings covered the refrigerator that had previously displayed nothing but corporate schedules. Adelaide's attempts at art, enthusiastic if not yet skilled, were framed and hung with the same care as the million-dollar paintings in the living room. Henry's tools had their own drawer in the kitchen, ready for the inevitable repairs that even the most expensive appliances required. On weekends, they would alternate between worlds. Sometimes they would attend the opera or charity galas where Vivian needed to appear. Adelaide in custom dresses, and Liam somehow making even formal wear look slightly rumpled. Other times they would go to Coney Island or street fairs in Brooklyn, where Vivian learned to eat hot dogs from carts and discovered that some of life's best moments cost less than her morning coffee. Sterling Technologies underwent changes too, subtle but significant. Vivian established a foundation for children with visual impairments, funded research into suppressed medical conditions, created whistleblower protections that actually protected. Henry consulted occasionally, his engineering mind finding elegant solutions to problems that had seemed intractable. He never took a formal position, preferring his repair shop where broken things became whole again under his patient hands. Adelaide's progress continued, incremental but constant. She attended a mainstream school with accommodations, made friends who knew her story but did not define her by it. She learned to read, slowly at first, large print becoming smaller as her vision strengthened and stabilized. She discovered a love of painting, creating works that captured light in ways that those who had never lost it could not quite achieve. Liam appointed himself Adelaide's unofficial protector and official best friend, roles he took seriously enough that he once faced down a playground bully twice his size who had made fun of Adelaide's thick glasses. The suspension was worth it, he declared, and even Vivian could not bring herself to disagree. The two children grew together, different as daylight and dusk, but inseparable as shadow and form. Time passed, as time does, healing wounds and cementing bonds. The scandal of Damien Cross faded into business school case studies and cautionary tales. Dr. Rodriguez, stripped of his license, found redemption in becoming an advocate for medical transparency, speaking at conferences about the pressure that led to his choices and the consequences that followed. He sent Adelaide birthday cards every year, always with the same message: an apology and a promise that her light would help prevent other darkness. The wedding, when it came, was neither the society event Vivian's position demanded nor the simple ceremony Henry would have preferred. It was, instead, exactly what Adelaide and Liam designed. A sunset ceremony in Central Park, in the exact spot where they had all first met. Adelaide, now 10, could see well enough to be the flower girl who actually saw the flowers she scattered. Liam, 9, carried the rings with a solemnity that lasted exactly until the ceremony ended and he could return to his natural state of motion. Vivian wore cream, as she always did, but this dress was softer, flowing rather than structured. Chosen by Adelaide, who insisted her mother needed to look like a fairy tale princess just once. Henry wore a suit that actually fit, though he still looked slightly uncomfortable in it, as if formal wear was a language he would never quite speak fluently. But when he looked at Vivian, when he spoke his vows about light and repair and second chances, Every word rang with the same truth that had first made her believe him about Adelaide's eyes. The reception was held at the penthouse, transformed for the occasion into something that looked like both Manhattan sophistication and Brooklyn warmth had collided and decided to dance. Liam and Adelaide performed a routine they had practiced for weeks, a combination of actual choreography and improvised chaos that had the guests alternating between laughter and tears. Adelaide's speech, delivered with the poise of someone who had learned to navigate darkness and light with equal grace, spoke of families that formed not from blood, but from belief, from the courage to see what others said was not there. As the evening wound down, as guests departed, and children finally exhausted themselves into sleep, Vivian and Henry stood on the terrace, looking out at the city lights. Each light, Vivian said, was a life, a story, a possibility. Some were bright, some dim, some flickering, but all were part of the same vast constellation. Henry pulled her close, mentioned that stars were just distant suns, that light traveled across impossible spaces to reach waiting eyes, that sometimes the journey took so long people stopped believing it would arrive. They stood there in comfortable silence, two people who had started as strangers in a park, brought together by a child's stumble and a man's refusal to accept conventional wisdom. Below them, the city continued its restless movement, unaware that above it stood proof that sometimes the impossible was just the possible, waiting for someone brave enough to believe in it. Adelaide appeared in the doorway, rubbing eyes that still tired easily, but saw more than most people ever would. She padded over in bare feet, designer dress discarded for comfortable pajamas, and wedged herself between them. She did not speak, did not need to. Her presence was statement enough. This child who had been condemned to darkness, who had been a pawn in corporate games, who had been written off by experts and authorities. She stood there, seeing the city lights with eyes that worked imperfectly but sufficiently, surrounded by the family that had formed from fragments of loss and hope. Liam joined them eventually, because Liam could not bear to be left out of any gathering. He brought his tablet, showing Adelaide a video of their dance from the reception, the two of them laughing at their own magnificent awkwardness. The four of them remained on the terrace as the city settled into its version of sleep, which was really just a quieter form of wakefulness. The truth, Vivian thought as she held her expanded family close, was never really hidden. It was just waiting for the right eyes to see it, the right voices to speak it, the right hearts to believe it. And sometimes, just sometimes, those eyes and voices and hearts found each other in the most unexpected places, like a park on a spring morning when a child stumbled and a stranger caught her, setting in motion a story that proved light could always find a way through darkness, no matter how complete that darkness seemed. Adelaide yawned, her eyes closing not from blindness, but from simple exhaustion. Henry lifted her easily, carrying her to bed, while Liam trailed behind, still chattering about something that had happened at school. Vivian watched them go, this unlikely family that had assembled itself from corporate power and working-class wisdom, from children who needed each other, and adults who had learned to need again. She remained on the terrace a moment longer, alone but not lonely, powerful but no longer isolated in that power. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, board meetings and homework, therapy sessions and business decisions. But tonight, in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. The darkness had been illuminated, the truth had been revealed, and love had built bridges across chasms that had seemed impossibly wide. In the distance, dawn was already thinking about arriving, painting the eastern sky with promises of light. And in the penthouse where a blind girl had learned to see, where a CEO had learned to trust, where a broken engineer had learned to hope again, and where a motherless boy had found a sister, the Sterling Carter family slept peacefully, knowing that tomorrow's light would find them ready, together, and whole.